Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the Online Trust Alliance webinar for the 2016 Online Trust Audit and Honor Roll. I'm Madeline Smith, and before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, reminding that all attendees will be on mute throughout the whole session, but please do send in questions using the chat feature. We will have time for some Q&A at the end. And also a reminder that we are recording today's session. That recording and this deck will be available on the OTA website. So for some background for those who are a little less familiar with OTA, we are a 501c3 charitable nonprofit, and our mission is to enhance online trust and empower users while promoting innovation and vitality of the Internet. We are member supported by a wide range of organizations, and it includes email marketers, email marketing technology companies, online advertising, ad tech companies, privacy and security companies, consumer brands, along with public and private organizations and agencies. Our goal is to help educate businesses, policymakers, and stakeholders while developing and advancing best practices such as the ones we will be covering here in the audit. This is our 8th year for the audit, and we're excited to share these benchmarks of best practices. And we would especially like to thank Symantec for underwriting this initiative, along with our supporting sponsors, Act On, DigiCert, Distill Networks, SiteLock, and ThreatWave.
Great, Maddie. Thanks for the introduction. This is Craig Spiezle, and welcome everyone on the webinar today. We will very quickly walk through the results, the methodology, and some of the key findings, and as Maddie said, take time for Q&A at the end of the call. So the number one thing that I want to share is why do we do the audit? And there's 5 or 6 principal objectives. We feel that in many ways there's a need in both the security and the privacy side to move from a compliance standpoint to one of stewardship, go above and beyond. As Maddie mentioned, we want to recognize leaders, companies that are doing the right things, and by doing so, provide them an incentive to enhance their practices, and ultimately to make security and privacy part of every company's value proposition to the consumer. And last but not least is we also are responding to increased calls from legislators and agencies worldwide for providing some objective scoring and ranking of sites of their security and privacy practices. So that sums it up. A few disclaimers real quickly. This audit was conducted for a 30-day period in April and May. It's important to recognize there's no perfect security, and sites' data may have since changed. We do not audit a site's business practices. We're only looking at their site security, data security, efforts to consumer protection, and such on there. It's not an endorsement of any company or services. Last but not least, somewhat unique this year is we had a significant increase in number of companies that contacted us during the audit period, asking for clarification and advising us that they've made changes. This involved every areas from their privacy policies to their email authentication practices and security scores. Being that our goal is to influence and drive adoption of best practices, when we were advised, we did rescore those sites, which may have impacted their ranking. So the overall concept of the honor roll is to focus on 3 major areas: consumer protection, security, and privacy. And this year, we looked at approximately 1,000 consumer-facing websites, the top 500 e-commerce sites, the top 100 banks, top 100 consumer services segment. And I should note that segment has evolved. We used to call that the social 50. We doubled the size, and really what the consumer services are sites that collect and require a user log on that are not banking or e-commerce. We've expanded the news sites to news on 100, federal government sites, as well as OTA members. The scoring, as mentioned, is a baseline scoring of 100 points each in security, consumer protection, and privacy, and it's weighted. Approximately 50 criteria this year, and depending upon the data attribute, there's more or less points applied. We also want to recognize emerging practices. They may not be mainstream yet, but we think they're very important, and sites that have adopted those as early adopters can receive bonus points. And conversely, sites also have penalty points, and that would be for vulnerabilities, inadequate privacy policies, data loss incidents, or regulatory fines. And last but not least, to qualify for the honor roll requires 80 base points, 80% I should say, providing you don't fail or you receive at least 55 points in each category. And we'll go into each one of these buckets in much more detail. So the great news is in this year we saw now 50% of sites qualifying for the honor roll. This was really a record achievement considering that in every area we've added more data attributes, we've become more detailed, and the bar has risen. And what's incredible is that companies have risen to that challenge, so to speak. 12% of the sites actually have qualified for the honor roll for 5 consecutive years, which we think is really important. And another factor to consider is when we looked at the internet retailers, it wasn't just the top 1 or top 10 that made the honor roll. We had the number 1 retailer as well as number 493. And what that really tells us that the bar or the honor roll is achievable by companies of a wide range of size and resources. And another aspect this year is we look a little deeper and we have what we call the top of the class. And basically those sites that scored 95% and 10% of the sites have made that this year. So that's a new criteria that we'll be measuring going forward. As we look at the honor roll, we also have tracked it over year. And as we said, the average was 50% this year. And we can see here the internet retailers, the top 100 were 50%, top 500 combined was 44%, banking sites now surpassed 55%, and the consumer services really pegged it up at 72%, whereas we saw a decline, not a decline, in the news segment, 23%. But what's important to note there is while they are 1/2 of, for example, the banking sites or 1/3 of consumer sites, they've grown exponentially from 4% 2 years ago, doubled last year, to almost a 3-fold increase. So great news there as well in achievement in all categories in the growth. And as we mentioned, one of our goals is to recognize leaders. And so Twitter, for the 3rd consecutive year, has received the number 1 ranking across all sectors. And as individually, online retailers, we have Gap. In the consumer services, as mentioned, Twitter, healthcare.gov on the federal sites. And what's interesting in both of those categories, consumer and federal, one of the factors that drove their scores to the top was their embracing and honoring the do not track signal from a consumer's browser, basically saying we will not collect any data and share it with any third party if you've enabled do not track. Very positive side. Iberian Bank, and a new leader in the banking sector, and then Google News. So great growth there. The other point that's also very significant is in the top 10. So we looked across all the scores in the top 10, as we mentioned Twitter, but there's a vast array. We have healthcare.gov, so government sites, many social sites in this social, or I should say consumer services. We have Pinterest, Dropbox, File Your Taxes, LifeLock, Instagram, and 1040.com. So really what we're seeing is the consumer services segment has done very, very well. And even within here, we have 2 of the leading e-file sites as well, and then the Gap. So all this is really good growth, and congratulations to these sites for their growth and accomplishments. Also, if you look at the report, on the appendix A, starting at page 30, you'll see here, for example, all the organizations that have made the honor roll, and you'll see a number in front of them that indicates a consecutive year. But the bold this year also flags or identifies those companies that have made what we call the top of class. So the companies American Greeting, Costco, and others has really risen above, and they've scored 95% of the available points. So again, it's another example of how we're trying to recognize leadership here. Jeff?
Right, so thanks, Craig. We also wanted to look at why companies fail. It's useful to see the ones that make the honor roll. That's great, but we also want to look at why did they fail and why, how could they make more improvements. And this chart shows in gold is the percent of sites in a given sector that made the honor roll. Blue is those that neither failed or made the honor roll, and red are those that had a failure in one or more of the categories. And you can see that in almost every sector, it's nearly bimodal. The retailers are the ones with the largest slice in between. If you equated this to like school grades, the honor roll is kind of an A-B honor roll with no Fs. If you have an F, you're kind of in the red category, and then if you're in the blue, in this case, you're kind of a C student, so to speak. So that's kind of the way it works out. There are a few sectors, and the federal sector, most specifically this year, where it truly is bimodal. You either make the honor roll or you fail. And so we like to look at those failures and kind of get some insight into what's lacking and what can be improved. This is another way of looking at the data, and we've been charting this for a few years now as well. And this is looking at the range of the data from the top score in a given sector to the bottom, and that's represented by the gold line or bar, and then the blue line is the median for that sector. And you can see that on the left side there, the retailers and the banks, the median is sitting right on top of that 80% number, which is the honor roll bar. So it's very easy from year to year to see a lot of sites achieve honor roll status and maybe next year fall below it. So this year we had roughly 150 that made the honor roll for the first time, but we also had 80 that made it last year that did not make it this year. So there are a lot of companies, quote, on the bubble, and as the bar raises each year, it just reinforces the fact that you need to keep pace with these new best practices to keep pace with the threats that are happening out there. You can see that the federal sites and OTA and consumer are well above, on average, the honor roll bar, and that's reflected in their achievement levels, although you see in consumer a very wide range, from one of the lowest scores overall to the highest with Twitter, just in that one category. If we look at what caused failures of those three buckets that Craig described that we assessed, the consumer protection category was by far the biggest driver of failures, and that's primarily driven by email authentication. And if we look inside that and say, okay, well, we're going to go into that in a few slides of what we look for, but the number one cause of failures was lack of DKIM, one of the email authentication methods, at the top level domain for the company. And that really drove that and was a reason for failure in many sectors. Site security, actually there weren't a lot of failures, but where they existed, we tended to see that it was either using old ciphers or they weren't supporting the latest, safest protocols, and that's what caused their failure. And then in privacy, the overall average was 16%, but I think in the news category it was closer to 60, and so that most sectors had a very low failure rate in privacy, but where that did exist, it was either due to broad data sharing practices where they did not state in their privacy policy that they wouldn't share data, or we found trackers on their sites that did share data broadly, and Craig will go into that category more specifically a little later on. Should note that sites can fail in more than one category. So if we look at this by sector, same thing. This is failure rates within sector or by sector in these categories. You can see consumer protection, a lot of the sites failed there. Many, the federal sites, half of them failed just due to inadequate email authentication. Over a third of the banks failed for that reason, and almost a third of the news sites. And so you can see that that is an area of concern. Kind of ironic because the overall stats look good, the adoption rates for a given method look good, but they aren't doing enough in that area to be passing our criteria. Again, site security was very low. I kind of explained that. And then in privacy, you see that most of the sectors were very low, but the news sector kind of pulled the average up by many of them having failure rates, and that was almost entirely due to a lot of trackers on their sites driven by their their business model of advertising and sharing data with third parties. Let's go into this first bucket here we call consumer protection. We're going to go into each of these three buckets, and they're organized very similarly. So the gray box is the baseline points that can add up to 100. The green is bonus points available in this category, and the red is the penalties that can be assessed in this category. So in this case, the gray, it's largely driven by email authentication, as I mentioned. There are two email authentication methods, SPF and DKIM. So we look for those at the top level domain or the corporate domain, you might say, that users are familiar with for the entity, for the site, and then any subdomains that are sending email. We also look for DMARC records, and I'll explain a little more about what that is in a minute, and then you can assert a policy within DMARC, and we look, that policy is worth points as well. So in italics, you see changes that happened between last year and this year. So in this case, we increased weight for the top level domain, support for email authentication, and also increased weight for having a reject policy for DMARC. You could get bonus points for TLS for email. This is opportunistic TLS, where you encrypt the sessions between the mail servers so that no one can eavesdrop. For DNSSEC, a more secure DNS, and for IPv6, which was new this year, we looked to see whether the website supported IPv6. That's the first year we've looked at that. You could get penalties for not locking your domain administratively, and only a few % don't. And then we also look at malvertising, specifically in the news and media sector, and Craig will be addressing those a little bit later. So a very quick email authentication overview. So I mentioned there's two methods, SPF and DKIM. One looks at the message path. Did it come from the source that you would expect for that sender? The other actually authenticates the content, where you sign the message and then you can verify that at the receiving end. And what this allows a receiver to do is just know it came from the purported sender and verify that through one of these two methods, or both actually is what we recommend as a best practice and how our methodology is set up. And then DMARC sits on top of those and leverages SPF and DKIM to give you more power, information, and ability to assert a policy. So you can tell the recipients that you want the messages to either be quarantined or outright rejected if they fail authentication, and send that signal out. But it also gives you visibility, because you can ask for reports back from those receivers and say, did my authentication pass or fail, and give me some specifics about that, either in an aggregated sense or a message-by-message sense. And that allows you to both fine-tune your own authentication or look at people that might be trying to spoof your domain, pretend to be you. So looking snapshot at some of the specific data we saw this year for these types of things. On the left set of bars there are what we saw for adoption of the SPF method at the top level domain for all these sites. The next one is DKIM at the top level, and you can see SPF is up there in the low 80s, probably averaged 82, 83 overall. And that's good. It could still be better. We need to see a little bit more adoption there, but it is getting up near the top. DKIM, however, is not. It's down in the 30s or approaching 40 in most categories, overall average of in the low 40s. And we really need to see this come up, because it provides additional protection from allows receivers to make good decisions about whether to pass on messages from senders, and protects the users from spear phishing and all the associated badness that comes with it. The best practice I mentioned for email authentication is to support both SPF and DKIM. So that's that next set of bars, and you can see it varies from the low 90s down to about sub 60% in the federal government, and they have the highest failure rate in this category. So they've got some work to do on bringing up their email authentication practices and adoption. DMARC is still down in the 20s and 30s for most sectors. Consumer is leading by far there, almost double any other sector. So we need to see that come up, because once SPF and DKIM are in place, DMARC can then help add some added power to that in giving receivers the ability to make the decisions and provide the feedback reports, as I mentioned. And then TLS, that's where it's encrypted between servers. We actually saw a huge jump year to year there. Last year, the overall average was about 23% for this. This year, it was 61, I believe. And so we're seeing that a lot more companies are encrypting their email between servers, and seeing a big push from Google especially to have this happen for both security and privacy reasons. Quick snapshot of DMARC adoption over the years. The email authentication adoption over the years has kind of seen a steady rise in both SPF and DKIM, even though the DKIM side of it is lagging. DMARC is about a 3-year-old or 4-year-old now technology, so we started tracking it when it first came out. You can see that it's in every sector gone up every year. This year we saw a great jump in the retailers, the top 500, from 8 to 21%. So it's still not as high as it could be, but it almost tripled, and that's great news. Where in the consumer 100 we saw a nice jump as well, to where they're almost at 2/3. We also look at the types of records that are published. So the rightmost column there indicates, as a percent of companies with records, how many have a reject or quarantine policy record associated with it. You can see that for the most part that's still down in the teens or low 20s. The federal actually is leading there, but their adoption of email authentication is very low. But we want to see both those numbers come up, both the number of companies that have records and the ones that can then move on to assert a policy that would allow recipients to take action on email that fails authentication, and therefore let less bad stuff through. The other thing we wanted to show you a quick snapshot here, and this is kind of a all or nothing almost in adoption, is DNSSEC, so that's a higher security on your DNS, and IPv6, which was new this year for us to look at. So over the past 4 years, you can see DNSSEC adoption is minuscule in most sectors except for the federal government, where there was a mandate to do it, and it's been up in the 90% range pretty steadily over the years in the federal government. IPv6, interestingly, is following a somewhat similar pattern. There's a mandate also in the government to move to IPv6 a few years ago, and they're in the mid-80s on adoption. But in most other sectors, it's sub 2%, with the exception of consumer, which has adopted it more broadly. It does provide a more secure platform for communication, although there can be some transition issues, so we're just starting to track that, and both of these are worth bonus points in this category.
Great, Jeff. We're going to jump very quickly to the site security, and I do see a few questions have come in, and we'll try to hold those questions if we can and address them in the wrap-up at the end of the program. Site security, again, following the model of the gray being the baseline points, bonus points we award for extended validation certificates and always-on SSL or HTTPS everywhere. Again, a protocol that really helps secure the entire web session from the client to the server for both security and privacy purposes. And this area has perhaps the biggest areas of penalty points, iframe, different exploits we find on the sites, malware, malicious links, risk as a site susceptible to bots, as well as DV or domain validated certificates. So I'll quickly walk through here the observations we saw. So the good news here is, all in all, we have very strong scores in the high 80s, 90s within all the segments. We didn't see a huge significance. The news segment is the lowest, but traditionally they're just regular logons. They're not dealing with credit card information and such on there, so it's nothing of great alarm there. Obviously some best practices they could do, increased diligence there. So again, they're highly clustered. Extended validation certificates, though, a huge significant difference. The banks lead at 70%. We've seen steady growth in that area, and then followed by consumers. And extended validation certificates provide the trust indicator to the consumer, a higher level of certification or authentication that the certificate owner is who they purport to be. And then again, great growth also in the always-on SSL area. Again, banks leading at 81%. These two criteria, always-on SSL and EV, I should point, they're also standards advocated by the banking industry, the IRS, OMB, and other industry segments. So that's one of the reasons we call out those as significant technical protocols to be adopted. So we use multiple tools for that, and so sites can very easily go. We have a site that we've partnered with Qualys, and you can run a configuration, a test against your site here. And what this point here, this slide here, is we look at the certificate strength, the protocol support, the key strength, as well as a cipher strength. And each one of those you could get a scores up to 100. It's also possible you could have a certificate score of 100 and a cipher strength of 40. In that case, you would fail. And that's really important because we look at, in the case of site security, you're only as strong as your weakest link here. So there's some very good tools up there to provide a lot of diagnostic and information for companies to test. There's another company we work with, High Tech Bridge, out of Switzerland, and again, provide additional tools. They actually test against PCI compliance, NIST standards, and others here. So again, tools that people can be checking out on an ongoing basis. If we look at trends over security, we've seen overall good growth. Although 2014 we did see a slight dip, but overall we've seen everyone has rebounded very well. And this was incredible because we really thought going into here, because we added more criteria this year, we would have seen a dip in the overall score. And impressively, the Federal 50 has done a great job, 92%. So real good growth considering from 83% last year. So great growth here, something we continue to monitor and evaluate. Jeff mentioned malvertising earlier, and for those of you who may not be aware of, malvertising is an increase in threat of where legitimate sites serve with their ads malicious code or malware. And so just by visiting a site, a user's device can be compromised. So we see this no different than actually if you had malware on the site or a malicious link on the site there. So it's very important. And this year, this was an addition. We only looked at the sites this year in the news and media area for this, though we do plan to expand this for all sites because we're seeing this compromise in different areas. So what we found is we only track the sites with malware, not the social or deceptive pop-ups, and 17% of the internet retail, the news and media sites had at least one incident, and 10% of the sites had one or more, or two or more, I should say. So major concern here, we see this as a growing threat vector, and the one that really requires more attention of any site that's relying on third-party content or advertising. And there was a correlation of, again, sites that had malvertising had a higher overall failure rate. So some key areas to be concerned about. I mentioned certificate type. There's three primary certificate types: domain validation, DV, organization validation, OV, and extended validation, EV. So what we see here is roughly 52% using organizational validated certificates, which is good because that type of certificate requires a verification by the company that they are the organization that's requesting it. Extended validation is even better at green at the roughly 31%. What's concerning is sites that have gone for the least expensive certificate type, domain validated, which really has very little authentication behind it, and we're seeing a direct correlation to the increased fraudulent and lookalike sites that come up and use a DV cert. So we're seeing more fraudulent activity in that area. We're seeing more discussions on browsers to put a warning for sites that potentially have a DV. So the call to action is look at your validation type of certificate and move to either an OV or DV certificate. So I'm going to jump to privacy real quick. Privacy is the third category, as we mentioned, the third leg of the stool, so to speak. And we look at the base points of 100 points broken into two areas. 50 points are basically on the privacy policy, what it says, how well it's clear and delineated, and then 50 points on what's actually happening on the site. And Jeff mentioned trackers. So this is third parties that are actually tracking your activity. And there are what we call benign trackers and one that are also concerning trackers. So the benign are anonymous analytics that a site may have, or first-party tracking where a site is only collecting for their purpose. What we're concerned about is the third-party trackers that do the retargeting and sharing that data with other sites here. So we look at those two areas here. Sites get bonus points for date stamping and having versions, archive versions, use of icons, honor and do not track, and multilingual policies. Now, many of these bonus points, what you'll see in all categories, after a certain period will become part of the core points. And as we talk at the end about changes, some of these may evolve next year into what core points. Penalty points are, again, areas where we think that's inappropriate. For example, if we're trying to increase trust and a site's registration is private, where you can't find out how to contact or who owns a site, you receive negative points. Data breach incidents, again, for every incident within the last 18 months, you receive negative points. And again, if you've had FTC or settlements on business practices, you receive negative points as well. So that's all in all combined here. So let's jump into a little more on the privacy policies. We've gotten a lot more detail this year, and we're really looking for clear disclosure of what data is collected, how long a site retains it for, how is it used, who's it shared with. So those are the core fundamentals. Again, bonus points for layered short notice. Do not track disclosures are required. So do not track is are you or do you not honor or do not track. How do you notify a consumer if you've required to share the data, and do you have a link on the home page? So these criteria, they're all explained more in our methodology, but that's how you can get up to 50 points if you have all of that. And as we take a look at that, of the total privacy scores I mentioned, it comprises of the policy and the tracking. We see the federal sites, the federal government, obviously having the highest score, average of 84, whereas the news and media sites at the lowest at 50. And as we peel back the onion on there, we can see the privacy policies, again, roughly 34 between the FDI, say the federal sites and the consumer sites, dropping down to FDIC. One of the reasons there is, again, many areas there, privacy policies are silent on those criteria, and also some of them because they share data with third parties. And then we look at the tracking score. Again, 50 is the maximum you can have. So great news for banks and federals. They're not, they don't have trackers on the sites. But you look at the news and media segment, which relies on advertising, and their business models today are heavily reliant on sharing and selling of that data. So again, you see their score less than half of those other scores here. So we mentioned the privacy policies, and this is what we consider there's some areas of missed opportunities. And again, we're only evaluating what the privacy policy says. So we've had many conversations with companies afterwards, and they say, well, we're not doing that. And the point is, well, if you're not doing it, your privacy policy should disclose that. So again, great news on the federal sites, 92% say they do not share data with any third parties. Data retention, conversely, we see very low addressing it. Of what happens after you stop having an account, what data is retained. So in this category, we're looking for just a statement to say we retain the data for this purposes for this long. So again, some low scores there and opportunities. Confidentiality, many sites rely on third parties. That's expected. But what we're looking for is a statement to say third parties who may have access to your data are held to the confidentiality and may not use your data for any other purpose. So again, the banks seem to be silent on that area. Consumer-facing sites at 78% have done a great job. Layer notice, again, averages are a little on the lower side. We'd like to see growth in that area, and the reason because we believe a short layer notice is more intuitive and easier for a consumer to navigate. And the do not track disclosure is an increasing concern for several reasons. One, it's mandated by the state of California, and sites are at risk of enforcement in that area. We've seen great growth. We've actually seen a growth of the average growth is 33% this year, up from 11% roughly the year before. So great growth, but we're seeing some areas very big concern. Ironically, federal government sites, 6%, and while technically they may not have to comply with state regulations because they're not a commercial entity, we would highly encourage government sites to walk the talk and really to adopt here. And so I mentioned the do not track, and this is very important, and the reason we have this separate slide here, it is required by the state of California. We can tell you the state of California is very interested on sites that are not fully disclosing, so we encourage you to have that. The other point, it's a very important note, is that the standard is now in a release candidate status, which means it's in the testing and implementation mode. So in the past, many companies had said, well, we're waiting for it to be complete the standards process. Well, that would be somewhat of a disingenuous statement right now. So if you are not honoring it, you should update your privacy policy to reflect the current status here. So we have some time here for Q&A in just a moment, but some of the general observations, and Jeff, maybe you can join me here on some of the positive things here that we really saw. And I guess, to kick it off here is number one, a record level of achievement across sectors and growth. And this is very, very positive. This
was actually kind of surprising because we were expecting the achievement to actually dip given the new criteria and weighting that we put in this year. So it was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, the other part that somewhat overwhelmed us is companies reaching out to us during the process. And we never have had that before. And several saying that we've read their methodology, we've now made this change, can you rescore us? And as mentioned in the earlier slides, we ended up rescoring sites when they reach out to us because, again, our goal is to influence and to encourage best practices. It's a little more work on our end, but we were very, very pleasantly surprised, and we're happy to do that, though we do have to be cautious on how scalable that is in the future. I think one of the areas that, Jeff, that I'd like to kind of discuss a little bit was the failures in email authentication. And this going in a few areas, and can talk about, you did a good point on the calling out the top level domain or the company domain. This would be otaalliance.org versus email.otaalliance.org. And we're seeing a disconnect there. The other thing that we also saw was, I'd say, inadequate or incomplete DMARC records. DMARC records that were published but did not have an RUA address or any way to receive reports there. Any comments you have on that area, Jeff?
Yeah, they were essentially what you might consider null records. There technically was a DMARC record there, and it said no policy enforcement, but it didn't ask for any feedback reports. And so it's really doing nothing, even though it technically is present. So we counted those as valid this year as just a base record. I think next year we most likely won't. That at a minimum, if you're using DMARC for the natural step is you start by putting a record there and getting feedback reports so that you can see what's going on and make sure your authentication is in good order. And then you can move kind of up the ladder to do quarantine and reject policy statements. We saw somewhat a similar thing with SPF records, which we did clamp down on this year. There were people using SPF records in test mode, and we did not count those as valid this year, which was different than previous years. So we did go that layer deeper this year, so we'll likely do the same with DMARC next year.
Well, great. The other area that we saw a fair amount of concern is on the site security. While we mentioned that the overall failure rate was low, when we did dig into those sites, we found the sites really and companies are not proactively monitoring. And it's really important because quite often a protocol or cipher is considered trustworthy at a certain point, but because a new breach is found. And so it really takes continuous monitoring. So that's an area, a need. It's less of a technical issue, but more of a process and operational call. The other area that directly related to it, in our attempts when we found malware, cross-site scripting, and other what we consider significant vulnerabilities, and by significant vulnerabilities meaning that we could ping a site and see an exploit and be with toolkits to be able to run an exploit against a site. We took it upon our responsibility to try to contact those sites, and we all in all failed, and primarily because if we did not have a contact, those organizations did not have a mechanism in place. And the reason I point that out is that's also a potential legal concern going forward for sites. Sites that fail to have an ability to receive responsible disclosures and ultimately have a security event would be deemed to be failing under Section 5 of the FTC Act of taking responsible security processes in place. And that's really important now because this is being called out. There is an NTIA working group, and if your site does not have a mechanism, whether it's a form, a bug bounty program, or some type of mechanism to receive, vet, and respond to them, you are setting yourself up for a potential claim. The other area too, we mentioned this whole point of moving past compliance, and one of really focusing on stewardship is privacy policies. All in all, are very difficult to read. We went through, and Maddie, myself, we had some other staff help us here on reading the privacy policies, and again, they scored very well in the ability to confuse a user, but very poor in readability. So encourage companies to review that. And what was interesting in companies that reached out to us, when we flagged certain things, the amount of confusion they even had on what their own language was saying, let alone what the language was relaying to on their site. And the last point is the high level of data sharing, and this is really the flag on the news and media sites. The most of them had 125 independent third parties that were collecting and sharing data on site users here. So big areas in the general observations. So some of the enhancements that we talked about, and then we'll go to Q&A here very quickly. We're looking through a whole process here. Every year we announce these, call for input, and we'll be taking input from consumers and users and site owners over the next 120 days or so. And then what happens is we'll take those feedback, we have working groups, we'll review these areas, and then we'll, after the first year, publish what the new criteria are. We've mentioned a few of these areas. We are going to be looking at more open ports and relays, advertising between multiple sites. I skipped over multi-factor authentication. That is going to be part of the requirements, whether it's core or bonus points. Do not track disclosures, again, we're seeing more weighting on that. The DMARC policies, again, I would say the inadequate DMARC records we mentioned, those will probably be scored with or not receive any scoring for those, and increasing weighting of SPF and DKIM. So these are some of the other areas, but we'll get into that time permitting the Q&A, but I want to make sure we have lots of time for the Q&A here. So last points before we forget is we are doing a deep dive in the email authentication in roughly 3 weeks. We'll go much deeper into the trends in that area. And as I mentioned, we have this open call for input on the methodology. And the other areas that, in addition to the methodology, pending some funding and grants, we're looking at to expend this to ISPs and cable providers, 50 states, looking at them, and that's a little more difficult because it's really looking at what are the core state agencies, the Department of Licensing, is it their healthcare site, what core agencies do we look at? So a lot of these other areas here. But with that, Maddie, I'd like to turn it back to you for some of the questions, and I see a few have come in as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Craig. So I'm just going to jump in with some of these that I've received. This first one is related to privacy policies, which you were just mentioning, and that is that there seem to be a range of what kinds of disclosures and which companies that did well or didn't do well. Does OTA have a point of view on standardizing privacy policies? Is that something that we should be lobbying for? What are the pros and cons of that approach?
Well, I'll take that one, Maddie. And I think, I hope you agree with this, considering the difficulty we had of trying to parse and understand and the difficulty that some of the companies had even in trying to explain and rationalize what they had in the privacy policy would be clear indicators that there's a need for that. I think, unfortunately, historically, privacy policies have been written by attorneys, for attorneys, to be as broadest and as convoluted as possible. So I do think that it's going to be interesting in this area. There's been suggestions and best practices. We haven't seen the willingness of trade groups to embrace this, but I believe that the FCC is going to be putting pressure on ISPs and carriers to have a standard, and that might be a sea change there. So yes, we'd like to see that. Love to get feedback from others on how we can make that happen, but it's something that many of us have been talking about for years and yet to see any traction in that area.
Okay, this next one is more of an overview question. You mentioned not only did some companies approach us and ask for guidance, but we also tried to reach out where we saw issues. The question is, what would we say, what would OTA say are the biggest barriers that companies throw up? If we say these are the best practices, you should do them, what do companies respond? Do they have pushback? And how does OTA help them through the pushback?
Well, actually, I think it's kind of there's a kind of a 7-step process that I think that companies go through. First, there's a little bit of a denial. There's a little bit of a argument at times, but then there's one of acceptance. And I think that's one of the most gratifying parts here. Companies at first, when we say, well, we found something on your site, it takes a very defensive view. We found something missing in your privacy policy. And then they'll try to rationalize, and then there's usually silence, and then usually comes back as acceptance. So I would say 99.9% of every interaction we've had has been embracing these best practices. So it's been very positive. And I think that reflects that the criteria and how we score it and how we're basing it off of industry practices that are out there.
That actually leads to this question, which is about the methodology and the research part, is how do we decide it says, can you provide more context on the process for the methodology and the scoring, the actual metrics? Where do they come from? How do you decide?
Well, I think, Jeff mentioned a fair amount of that already, but again, it's a public call for comments. We look at that, we look at adoption, we look at challenges. We actually go back out, we ask feedback from academia, researchers, we reach out to government agencies, and we also look at the global impact in that area. So that's the criteria. The scoring and the weighting, that's somewhat proprietary, but again, it's based on adoption, and it's like I said, in many areas, we think something's important, it's a bonus point for a few years, and when we see adoption hitting a tipping point, at that point we start to make that part of the core points or increase weighting on that.
Great. This next one is also methodology, but it's more about could you please explain more about how the sites are selected? for the different business areas?
Yeah, so the sites, there is a methodology in that as well. So the top 500 e-commerce sites are based on data provided by Internet Retailer Magazine, based on a year-end revenue. So that's how you get to be part of the Internet Retail 500. The FDIC is a list they publish of the top 100 banks based on net assets. As we look at other categories such as the consumer segment sites, that's a combination of different sectors and site traffic. We look at representation. We have the e-file sites within that. We have identity theft protection sites. We have social sites, dating sites, document sharing, and a broad category that comprises that, what we call the Consumer 100. So it's basically site traffic and key subcategories. So, again, the methodology is based primarily on publish list and or site traffic combinations.
Great. This one is a quick one that says, how do I find out more detail on the sites, the specific sites that you measured? Can I find out who failed? Can I find out what people's scores are?
So again, great question you asked. Unfortunately, it's one we hear. People always want to know who does the worst, and you both know. And again, part of our mission is about positive affirmation. So we don't believe in throwing people directly underneath the bus. Again, if you go back to that slide or the pages in the report, the appendix, you get to see companies year to year. And, when companies have been made the honor roll for the last 5 years, that's a really good indicator. Conversely, if you go back and you can't find a company, you may want to ask why. But again, we don't disclose those results other than directly to the domain holder themselves upon request. So Maddie, before we I did see another question that came in on DMARC a little bit, and a few questions about the reporting part. And Jeff, maybe can you articulate a little bit of what you're saying? It was effectively a null record, someone said, and they were kind of confused.
Okay, so in a DMARC record, there's a certain syntax that you use to specify what you are telling the receiver to do. And so the two big categories are asserting a policy of whether you want nothing to happen or whether you want the failed authentication messages to be rejected or quarantined. So that's one. And then another major category is you can request reports to come back to you, either aggregated reports or message-by-message reports that have details, so you can see how a message failed authentication or batches of messages failed authentication, and maybe another information there, so you can fine-tune your own authentication. There are several sites that we found where they put a DMARC record up and it had a policy of none, and it didn't ask for any reports. And so it's really not telling the recipient anything, and doesn't have any impact. And that was my own term where I said it's kind of a null report because it doesn't really have any true value. So we did see a number of those, not a huge number, but in the single-digit % of the DMARC records that we saw. To the point where we're thinking we need to assess those records, not just does it exist or not, but does it have an impact or not?
Right, and one of the things that we are looking at, there seems to be a correlation to those DMARC records coming from one or two email service providers. And we saw a similar thing in the early days of SPF, that some email service providers said, well, just throw an SPF record up there, put a question mark all, and then we're done, and you won't get flagged by ISPs. And it appears that we're seeing some of the similar practices that, again, it's someone's going through the effort of having it up there to say it's done, but not recognizing there's no value. So, at the very least, I think next year that they won't get any points or some have suggested we actually go the other end and actually give negative points for that. I'm not sure we're there yet, but that's certainly the areas that we'll be looking at feedback on. You know, again, lots of negative parts on there. Not only, you know, again, not having that reporting is, again, it provides no value at all. In fact, just the opposite. It may even provide a false sense of security. There was a follow-up question, Jeff, that I think, you know, we've had this question before, that some of the data and the breakdown, for example, on DMARC, showing, for example, the difference between a record and the RRQ, and how, for example, the federal 40, it said 40% had a rejected quarantine record, but only 20% had a record.
Record at all.
Yeah, so if we do the math on that, so 20% of the 50 sites had a record, so 10 sites had a record in the federal 50 that we assessed. 40% of them had a reject or quarantine assertion, so that means 4 sites. So 10 had a record, 40% of the 10 had an assertion of request or reject or quarantine. So only 4 sites out of the 50 actually had a policy assertion like that. So that's what it means, is that one column is as a percent of sites with a record, how many had reject or quarantine. So it's a subset.
Right, and one of the things that we've noticed in our deep dive that we'll be doing in a few weeks is that percentage changes. And so as we've seen the adoption of having a record increase, we see in some areas the percent goes down for the first year because they're in that test mode, not test mode, but they're in they're monitoring mode and looking at the reports. So before they turn it on to reject. So, but I think we have much more data to share in that area.
Yeah, that's right.
Maddie, did you have one or two more we have time for?
Yeah, I have the one overall question, which you kind of already touched on, but if you had to sum it up, what was the biggest revelation of this year in the study from OTA's perspective?
I think, to me, and I'd be interested in, Jeff, your perspective, but I think the level of organizations that we've never touched before that reaching out to us, asking for help, clarification, and then actually making changes, and some major retailers and major banks. So, you know, very gratifying to see that. So, you know, sometimes we focus on the negative. I think the positive would be that, and I think that's also just reflected in the overall growth. So I think that would be my comment.
Yeah, I guess mine is similar, although I would probably do it in reverse order because they weren't. The requests weren't coming to me directly, I guess, and that is, given as we developed the methodology and the weighting, we were kind of expecting neutral to negative bottom line results on honor roll achievement and overall, you know, average scoring and such. And we actually saw scoring go up in the email authentication area and the site security area, despite we had ratcheted up the criteria pretty high in both of those. We did see privacy, I think, dip slightly because we got tighter in that area, and that was expected. But the overall result of 50% making the honor roll was great. Sites had really stepped up over this last year more than we expected.
Yeah, one other thing that, Maddie, I think at that point is a good example of growth is, you may recall in February we did an audit of the 13 free e-file providers. We did that. These are IRS approved sites where you go to submit your free tax returns. And of that results, of the 13, 6 of them received failing grades. And the positive news is these companies we've never dealt with before or worked with, they all ended up resolving their problems, and they all, not only did they not fail, they all made the honor roll. So that was really positive results that I saw, and to show again the ability that our criteria were objective, obtainable, and easily to resolve. And most often, these are the basics. And so that was also very rewarding and positive to see that level of change.
Yeah, and Craig, I think that was an example of more of an awareness thing. If people are aware of some of these best practices, they're not hard to put in place. They don't cost a lot of money or time or require a super high level of technical expertise. It's a matter of attention and awareness, and that kind of reinforced that whole exercise.
Well, great, Maddie. I think you want to, at this point, I think we're at the top of the hour, so I want to thank you for the questions, and Jeff for your time, and those on the call today. Again, you can send questions to us at admin@otalliance.org. We will be posting this recorded webinar and deck this evening. And again, thank you for your time, and look forward to working with everyone in the future to improve your scores and make the honor roll. Thank you.